This is Defender Radio. I'm Michael Howie, and this is Defender Radio, the podcast for wildlife advocates and animal lovers, brought to you by the Fur Bearers. I have watched a lot of content in the last year and a half, but little of it has hit me in the heart and mind as thoughtfully and powerfully as the Oscar-nominated animated feature WolfWalkers. I'll rewind briefly. Earlier this year, friends of mine, Christopher and Cynthia of the Not About Lumberjacks podcast, suggested that I try connecting with a filmmaker they knew, Tomm Moore. He's an environmentalist, has made these incredible films, and is an all-around interesting fellow, they said. A great interview for Defender Radio. So, while connecting with Tomm and his team at Cartoon Saloon to arrange the chat, I immersed myself in his work, namely the trio of Irish folklore-based films he'd helped create. All of the films are outstanding, and I strongly recommend them, but WolfWalkers leapt off the screen for me. By the way, there's spoilers ahead, so spoiler alert. WolfWalkers is described by imdb.com as the tale of a young apprentice hunter and her father journeying to Ireland to help wipe out the last wolf pack. But everything changes when she befriends a free-spirited girl from a mysterious tribe rumored to transform into wolves by night. The depth of characters, themes, and the sheer beauty and vision in the artwork of WolfWalkers is astounding. It was an amazing opportunity to sit and chat with Tomm about the environment, traditional ecological knowledge, how storytelling brings together generations of people who can all see themselves in characters, and ways of moving forward in the world together. But rather than tell you more about it, let's just have a listen. Remember to follow me on Instagram and TikTok at HowieMichael for some cool behind-the-scenes stuff, like what Tomm was sketching during the first half of this interview. I thought an interesting place to start would be back around 2001. I was doing some reading about yourself and your partners behind Cartoon Saloon, and the evolution of getting to The Secret of the Kells, which is kind of the project that launched a lot of these other projects we'll talk about. So if we could spend just a few minutes looking at that, what was it like in 2001? You're sitting around wanting to do something different or wanting to take on some of these converging passions. What was that part of life like? What was that process for those first few years?
Yeah, it was pretty crazy. Like, we just graduated in 99, 2000 from college, and we'd a lot of our classmates had kind of gotten into video games because there was the explosion of Tomb Raider, and a lot of the 2D studios in Ireland had closed down or moved back to the States. And a lot of people were kind of retraining in their final year of college in CG. But at the same time, you know, stuff had come out like Mulan, and we discovered stuff like Richard Williams' Thief and the Cobbler. And we were looking at, like, some attempts had been made to incorporate, like, what's the word? Like traditional art forms into hand-drawn animation, and we were kind of excited by that. You know, that Mulan had some sort of Chinese brush painting in it, and the Thief and the Cobbler looked like a Persian miniature. So we were like, if we could do something like that with Irish art, wouldn't it be cool? And also, wouldn't it be nice if we could continue this kind of college vibe that a lot of us were on just a bit longer? Like, I think we were trying to, I think the feeling was that we could probably naively imagine that we could make something that would be cool, and then we go and get real jobs, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And we were kind of idealistic. We thought we could do something interesting, with, I suppose, Irish art or Celtic art in quotes, before, you know, Disney or somebody else kind of got to it. Because at the time it seemed like they were doing like Greek-inspired stuff with Hercules, the Chinese-inspired stuff with Mulan, and, you know, they'd done The Hunchback here in Paris and stuff. So we thought we could do something. And originally, I don't even think we thought it would be a feature. I think we originally thought we could pitch it as some kind of, you know, extended short film, like a TV special or something. But it just sort of grew, and the studio was kind of an extension of Young Irish Filmmakers in Kilkenny, where I grew up. I'd been a member of Young Irish Filmmakers, which was like a group that was set up in the 90s for, ostensibly for kids to use the equipment to make their own films. But it sort of was also a very progressive, nice place for kind of arty kids to hang out if they weren't sporty or whatever. And so whenever they offered us the space and a small grant to try and make our idea, that's sort of when the snowball started rolling, really. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's speaking of, quick plug, the Fur Bears currently has an arts grant that will help people promote coexistence methods. Find out more at thefurbears.com. Now that I'm going to get paid
Nice.
again for the week, I did read, and I found this enjoyable, in that it is the story none of us want to be true, but becomes true. While attempting to make your dream projects, you all went out and got kind of boring jobs to pay the bills.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's the universal story
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
when you have to pay the bills. You have to get through. When I was trying to get into newspaper business, I had jobs at fast food restaurants and delivering pizza. And
Oh
in
yeah.
between those, you're sitting down with a notebook and writing and coming up with pitches. But
Yeah.
you still got to put gas in the tank and all of that. Do you think
Well, I
that
felt really lucky. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna ask. Do you think that kind of struggle, even if it's within the industry, helps
Mm.
then as an artist and a storyteller for you collectively?
Yeah, well, we were definitely earning our stripes. I think like I'd worked as a hairdresser or as like an assistant in a hairdresser's. I'd worked in Supermax, which was like the Irish version of a McDonald's, and
Hmm.
I'd done all those kind of jobs through college. And then in the late 90s, there was kind of this explosion in CD-ROMs for schools, and school books were, moving into CD-ROMs and online. So
Hmm.
there was a certain amount of work I was picking up as a freelancer that myself and Paul had been doing. And that was kind of part of the start of the studio. We kind of felt that we could, those kind of little, early flash e-cards and different little jobs like that could kind of help supplement our income while we were trying to make our own film. But really that was the story of like us kind of learning how to tie our shoes, basically. Like we were basically learning how to be a studio, how to work together as a team, how to pitch and win contracts. You
Yeah.
didn't automatically just get given jobs. There was competition for them. So we were kind of learning everything. We were cutting our teeth in the industry. And it kind of took us doing that as well for funders to take us seriously for our own personal projects too. So yeah, it was worthwhile. They're hard. I mean, one thing I never really liked doing was commercials. I always found them a bit stinky because I kind of felt like while they paid well and there was something kind of buzzy and exciting about them, you always ended up finding your like almost like using your powers for evil or something.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
your child, if only one child buys this fucking rubbish breakfast cereal or whatever, then my work, my 6 weeks of work will be worth it. It was always a bit funny, but that's it. We live in capitalism. That's how we pay
Hmm.
the bills.
And it does then allow for you to become in a position where you run Cartoon Saloon and you are creating
Yeah.
what I believe is one of the best films I have seen in the last 20 years with WolfWalkers.
Holy
Um,
shit! Thank
it
you.
is it
That's
is
high
well,
praise, sir.
well, we're gonna get into it, but
Right.
I've watched it twice back to back. So I when I review things, I tend to go through it once just to get a
Uh-huh.
feel, and then go through making notes and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But before we got there, this idea of combining the passions in the storytelling, I really enjoy, because it's not just the Irish folklore, it's not just Irish arts. There's also messages of environmentalism through a lot of this,
Mm,
and a lot
mm,
of messaging about authority, I would say too. That's kind
mm,
of
mm,
consistent through the films.
mm.
And as I said, I have more specific stuff about Wolfwalkers, but how did that work in? And do you think there is a commonality or duality between talking about environmentalism, some of these kind of, I guess, sort of classic coming of age stories, and authority figures in our
Mm.
lives?
It's been a learning. It was a learning thing for me. And I think what I also realized is there's a certain amount you consciously put in, and
Mhm.
there's other stuff that just sort of evolves from your life experience because they take a long time to get off the ground, and you're writing and rewriting and, developing them over a long period. So whatever I think the director or the main sort of people developing the project are concerned about tends to work its way in. And then there's a really interesting thing is that by the time it gets released, because you're dealing with mythology and you're dealing with these kind of archetypal sort of fable like stories, there's often something in in the zeitgeist that you're picking up on, that other people pick up on, and you're like, oh, that is what we were talking about, even if we weren't 100. Like I always joke that we talk about very Irish things like the church and the English and the depression, drinking, and all this kind of stuff. It's all in there, even if you're trying to make a relatively broad appeal family movie. It's funny.
Yeah, and I think that also then, though, allows other people to connect with it in their own way, right? Because if there's sort of the broad theme of authority, which for those of you who grew up with, the church and Northern Ireland, and I'm not going to try and explain that in 5 seconds, but,
sure.
The Troubles, then for you, the church and the state are going to play the significant authority role. Whereas for me, authority more ends up landing in terms of, technology maybe, and dealing with mega corporations, because that's been my experience.
Yeah.
So I think it does then sort of allow for the audience to connect in their own way, which is always, I think great storytellers can do that. Whereas for me, when I try and do fiction, I'm like, no, this is the message right here. I'm going to underline it for you, and the book's going to be a page long. Because
you might as well just
well, news writing teaches us to be a little concise, so it's be kind, underline the end. Maybe a cute picture of a bunny.
I think there's something about these old stories that you go digging for the truth. Will Collins, one of the screenwriters that we worked with a lot, he always talks about you're looking for that painful truth, the bit that's more than just you kind of go, oh, I know that, And what's really interesting is if you find that for yourself, other people might find that they respond to it as well. If you're authentic enough with the characters, I find other people read into it. And I find that really interesting because it stops being your own and it starts being the audience's. And like quite recently with WolfWalkers, I saw that a lot of like young queer people really identified with it. And definitely, while we were working on it, was mentioned a few times that it could be read as a coming out story, but it wasn't something we were leaning into and thinking about all the time. We just said, oh, that's one possible read. But the amount of queer people, at least online, that spoke about it as an allegory, I thought was kind of interesting, because I think at another time in history that mightn't have been seen. It might have been just seen as a coming of age or, found family kind of story. But whatever's going on for the audience, and as I say, in the zeitgeist or whatever, tends to kind of filter through. I remember we were working on Secret of Kells. It was all about walls, and he was trying to build a wall against the Northmen, and he was trying to build the walls, and then how much that became part of the culture. When we ended up having a screening here in Paris one time, the day that Donald Trump was elected, I remember having to introduce the movie and kind of saying, walls aren't really a good idea. We've been talking about this for a while. So it's really interesting how some of these themes end up, coming around and becoming relevant again. Maybe it's a bit depressing too.
Well, no, is it depressing? I mean, it's two of us who were involved in the humanities here. So is it depressing to look at history and try and learn from it? Well,
I think it's kind of depressing sometimes when you realize that stuff that, like, say, 20 years ago, we were already concerned about, and how you kind of it stays relevant. You'd kind of love to imagine that, it's totally irrelevant to talk about these type of things because the world has improved so much, but I guess life doesn't work like that.
Well, and that's a perfect segue. One of the notes I made, I was typing lines and stuff to myself when I watched the second time for WolfWalkers, is the comment from the Lord Protector: "What cannot be tamed must be destroyed." And it is something that in my work today, 2021, trying to advocate for wildlife in urban situations and just coexistence in the basic premise, is this concept that if we can't control these animals, we have to get rid of them. And it is fascinating to me how easily that commentary slides into what I do currently, how it slides into commentary on social issues of other types, and how it is very, very fitting for an Irish tale of that era as well. It really speaks to what you were saying of sort of these classic stories have that reach.
And we're still shaking off all those colonial ideas. I mean, it's amazing when I think about it. Like, when we read up on it, the idea that, also touching into ideas like speciesism, where the idea that the Irish could be described as animal-like, or this connection sort of made that they were like wolves and they were wild and dangerous and untamable, was a way to justify the treatment and the colonial way of looking at things. So, it's sadly still very much with us.
Well, and I think that also then speaks to what you were saying of a younger generation then seeing themselves in that
Yeah,
sentiment.
yeah,
And
yeah.
how does that feel for you to recognize that, people are seeing the clear message that comes through
Mm.
these films, but then that there are young people saying, I find myself in this story and it brings me comfort.
Yeah, as long as I don't inadvertently say something I didn't mean to say, that's maybe negative or whatever, I'm delighted, because to me, you're just a torch bearer. You're just taking it from the last generation and hopefully passing the stories on and reimagining them. And then there'll be another generation that will tell them again, hopefully, and it'll have a different meaning, because that's what kind of keeps those stories going. There's some kind of just commonality through the ages that keeps them alive, or the parts of them that are emphasized at different times in history can be interesting, like where the focus is in some of these old stories, but
Mhm.
they continue to have a mythic resonance. And so, yeah, you just feel like, I love it when audiences find something in it that I didn't particularly intend. I find that just fantastic, because it means the story has a life of its own and it's going to continue on after me.
Yeah. I wanted to talk a lot about WolfWalkers because it's very fitting for us right now. For myself, you may or may not be aware, in Canada we have numerous wolf culls on right now in really
Mm,
poorly managed attempts to protect other species that the science from the government themselves say is wrong.
mm,
And we just went through a situation where about a dozen coyotes were killed in an urban
mm,
park after a lot of really bad mistakes were made by decision makers for about a year or longer. So for me, the message of the canids in Wolfwalker was very on
mm,
point. And I
mm,
have to address too the role of the father, played by Sean Bean,
mm,
who is everyone is delightful in this. Sean Bean's the
mm,
name that my audience will know, but
mm,
uh, every performer was just on point, and it's so wonderful to listen to. And even then, the subtleties and the dialects and things. But anyway, off topic. Um, I think that storyline or that plot point, that character really resonated with me because, as I said, I lost my father this year, so there's a lot of that recollection, right? There's a lot of
mm,
that looking backwards and in myself to see that identity. And there's one line from him that it just made me start to cry in a good way, not in a bad way, where he's arguing about fear with his
mm,
daughter, and finally kind of expresses, "I'm afraid," and he's afraid that you'll end up in a cage. To which she
mm,
responds, "I am in a cage." By the way, spoilers.
mm,
I'll put that at the top of
mm.
the episode too.
Yeah, yeah.
But it is a beautiful moment that caused me to make an instant connection with behaviors of my father that
Mm,
had often been associated as negative things. And again, it's in myself recognizing the role fear has played in decision
mm,
making, and it's something I'm very aware of with an anxiety condition or a disorder.
mm,
But then I'm also able to draw a connection to some of the other characters, as sort of the directors and producers. Is there a conscious attempt to say, who is this character and how are they going to be challenged, or how are they going to confront themselves? Because I think that's one of the things about Wolfwalkers that I really took away is every character had to in some way confront themselves,
yeah.
and who they are, which was, it's not something you often get to see sort of across the board this way.
Yeah, it was an interesting journey developing the project. And I think a lot of the time myself and Ross as middle-aged guys got a little bit sidelined into thinking about the dad character, and it's fun to impersonate Sean Bean while you're drawing caricatures of him and, imagine things for him to say and stuff. And we
Yeah.
had to kind of keep, well, he ended up kind of having to serve the function of being a kind of loving antagonist to Robin,
Yes.
and that she kind of completes her arc about midway through the movie and really is able to embrace this aspect of herself that she's just discovering. And then she has to kind of drag him along, because like a lot of us, as you get older, you get a bit kind of calcified into ways of seeing the world. And it's a bit harder for you to change than it is for a young person, you know. So I suppose that's what we were kind of looking at, that was a key relationship in early drafts that kind of got moved along as we realized that the core was the two girls, and we had to keep them at the core and their journey at the core. And then dad, you know, Sean Beans, we called him Bill Goodfellow, even though he's never referred to, I think, as Bill. And I think his character arc is just that little bit more extended over a longer thing. And I suppose that fear, like that way of parenting, maybe it's something I've been working out myself too. I mean, I'm a grandfather now, and it's really interesting for me to think about, you know, how through these movies I've been working through a lot of the mistakes, or the loving mistakes, the well-intentioned mistakes you make as a parent, you know. And then also just as a person in society, how we're so reluctant to change, and why we're so reluctant to change, you know.
And that theme of change and reluctance, and then the connection to environmentalism, again, in I think all of your products or all of your films is very apparent. There is that connection. An element of it that I'll just say outright, I think the animation is absolutely stunning. The artwork blew me away. The change in perspective from people to animal as well. That world felt magical to get to see for a moment, and you didn't overuse it. It's almost like the reverse effect of Bruce the Shark, right? Like it's not there, it's there, and you know it's there, and it's exciting when it's there, but because it's not there all the time, it becomes even more exciting.
Yeah, exactly. It's funny we were just talking about that today. Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that's it as well. Like, you want to keep the grace notes, don't you? And with a visual language that you can have in hand-drawn animation, that we kind of made it our mission to really push hand-drawn animation as far as we could in terms of what you could do to be expressive with it. Yeah, you also have to, you know, keep your powder dry too, because we're still making these on relatively small budgets and stuff. So you have to sort of pick your battles and decide when you're going to really, you know, go for it and stuff. But no, thanks a lot. I love when people notice or recognize the stuff that we're doing with the visual language, because sometimes I get frustrated that animation as an art form, maybe in short films and festivals, you see real experimentation. But up until the last few years, a lot of animation was kind of following this route of trying to be as much like live action as possible to be taken seriously, where actually animation can do a whole lot more than live action if you're, you know, brave with it.
Well, and I think, you know, a great example, and I commented on this, I think, within 3 seconds of seeing it, and then noted it throughout the film, is the wolves. So there's the WolfWalker wolves, who tend to have more distinction to them and are separate. But then the other wolves, when they move, it is a single fluid motion. I think the other time that comes to mind is the film from like the 1980s, The Last Unicorn, when they run in a wave. But that implies so much about, you know, it's just beautiful and beautiful to look at, but then it also implies so much about how wolves actually move in the wild, and that they do have this cool kind of, they're apart, but they're always together somehow.
Yeah, and I think we moved away from pure anatomical correctness, or, you know, whatever, because we wanted to kind of be expressive and to kind of show that, you know, the army were moving like little clockwork kind of figures, and they were very stiff and, you know, segmented, and that the wolves were kind of more flowing and all, that they became kind of like a force of nature or whatever in themselves. So all that kind of stuff is the fun stuff you can do with animation, and hopefully it helps reinforce our theme of, you know, the artificial order being imposed by the colonizing forces, and then the more natural but maybe a little bit dangerously wild, you know, what's represented in the forest, and playing with those contrasts visually so that we could talk about those themes in the story itself.
Yeah, and it allows it to then kind of permeate through the mind as well, because you're not being told directly, you know, watch the wolves. You just happen to watch the wolves, and it becomes part of the art of it. And another element of that jumped out to me was the and I asked a few people I know with degrees, hoping they'd have the right words, but I think it's is it the medieval style tapestries that some of those, that sort of skewed perspective?
we were playing with woodblock prints. We were trying to
Okay.
see like what could we do that had that feeling of a woodblock print, but also that if we use geometry like that, could we kind of reflect the worldview of the Puritans, that they're much more
Yes.
sort of black and white and segmented, and everything is kind of it's like when we looked at maps of the country, everywhere that they mapped sort of became all these squared off and named, and so that was kind of how it was. And it went from being like just wild, nobody knew what was there, to sort of being under control because they'd mapped it. And a lot of those shapes, that's why we kind of put the town kind of flattened out behind, because that's all been mapped and colonized. And then the forest is still wild and kind of not fully kind of controlled yet, so that's
Well, yeah,
visual
and
language. Yeah.
it really is, and it definitely comes across as this is now distinct and different. And for me,
Mm.
I grew up without any religion, but it makes me think of old religious monolithic
Yeah.
type structures and things like that, which is the stark
Yeah.
contrast again to the majesty and magic of the forest and the natural world.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that culturally you can't escape. Like, I mean, I'm very lapsed Catholic, but like because I from Northern Ireland originally and grew up in Ireland and everything like that, all that iconography and all that imagery and stuff, it just permeates the way you see the world and how you think about the world and stuff. So yeah, definitely. And it's been a spiritual journey as well. These three movies have been a spiritual journey for me, kind of exploring where my spirituality lands now that organized religion has sort of fallen into the backdrop of the way I think about things.
Oh,
Yeah, it's funny.
absolutely.
It's funny that you mentioned The Last Unicorn there too, because it's one of those movies that's super dark. And I realized that, like, I'm 44, right? So I grew up in the 80s with like Secret of Nim,
Mhm.
Dark Crystal, Labyrinth, like these kids' movies, The Black Cauldron, The Last Unicorn. Those movies, like, were what I understood as kids' movies. But if you look at them now, they never get made now. Like, they're
Oh no.
quite dark and they play with really dark imagery and mythic themes and stuff like that. And I think it's really come in, people kind of say our stuff is really dark, but I think it's because I grew up with those kind of movies. As flawed as they might be now in retrospect, there was a tone or a feeling off them that
Mhm.
I kind of like to try and remember. Yeah.
And
Would have the
I am
nostalgia.
sure there is a university course on that theme, or there are books on it, because I'm fascinated by the detail art can get into, looking at
Yeah.
that kind of thing. Part of that, though, I thought maybe you would be able to sort of summarize, was the inclusion of Cromwell as the Lord
Mm,
Protector, and then
mm,
the whole concept of Irish wolves, and you were
mm.
able to tell what are truly disturbing, violent tales in a way that did not necessarily come across as disturbing, violent tales. So the impact of them and the emotional resonance of this British person coming and telling the Irish people who to be
Yeah.
and how to live and to try and
Yeah.
control nature is there, but it's not the brutal history.
Yeah, it could be really dark. And I think in live action, or if we played it, and I think we wanted to stay in the realm of, yeah, like there's a certain tone that I think illustration and hand-drawn animation has to it naturally, that allows you to kind of talk about these complex things in a way that's a bit more palatable than
Mhm.
if you were doing it like hyper realistically. But we did at one point back away from calling him Cromwell on screen. I think anybody who knows their history will know it's Cromwell,
Yeah.
and we definitely thought of him as Oliver Cromwell, but he kind of just became this figure that represented that kind of colonial worldview that was so common back then.
And I recommend people look that up, because that's an important part of world history, and frankly, part of North American history in a way too.
Yeah, what I found really interesting was that it was so common to what was happening in North America. And just before we started recording, we were talking about the colonization of North America, and that
Yeah.
mindset, all over the world, in Australia as well, like Indigenous people everywhere sort of suffered from this mindset that, and the thing about Simon McBurney, who played Lord Protector, he's an English fella, but I think he's got Scottish background. But he said that he's a very dangerous villain, or a very dangerous person, because he's a true believer. He really believed
Yes.
he was doing the good thing. He was doing God's work. And that's the most dangerous type person. Like any kind of, shifty character who's just an opportunist, they're not quite as dangerous as the true believers, because they're really scary, because they think that what they're doing is for the good of everyone. And, they won't let anything get in their way of that.
Like going to a rocket in space while the world melts, but we're not going to name any names. Now, on that note, the environmental messages, it is very clearly something you are passionate about, something that
Mm,
comes through in the films. Uh, do you see opportunities to, if not highlight problems or address problems, look at solutions as well through this kind of storytelling
yeah.
and that unlocking of the creative mind and looking at history and folk tales?
Yeah, and it's hard as well because ultimately it's a tragedy because we end the movie, for these characters at that moment in time, things are better, but we all know the wolves are not. There's no wolves left in Ireland, and
Yeah.
we lost so much of our woodlands to build the British Navy or whatever, and there's a lot of sad history after that, and so we're always trying to dose it and figure out how we could tell a story that was compelling in and of itself, but also opening up this the conversation maybe between parents and kids about the stuff and the environmental stuff. I mean, it just becomes more and more relevant. Like as the years go by, I mean, I was always a little bit of a sort of hippie and environmentalist or whatever, and Ross as well, who co-directed with me. We both grew up very concerned about species going extinct, and a lot of that stuff was why we wanted to tell this story, because we kind of realized that we'd learned as we learned about how Ireland had been so associated with wolves, that had even been called Wolfland, and the fact that we'd grown up never really thinking about wolves as part of Irish culture, we'd lost so much of ourselves. We'd lost so much more than just the wolves whenever they were exterminated. And I think that's what we kind of wanted to speak to as well. That there's a huge loss for humans as well whenever we're destroying. I mean, not just like that we get sick and there's pandemics and pollution and all that, often climate change and all of that. But even just on a very human societal level, there's a connection to nature that we kind of are losing more and more as we kind of imagine that we're somehow civilizing and putting order on things. We're actually just losing an awful lot of um, a lot of what we need in order to find solutions. Like I read this book, Braiding Sweetgrass. Did you ever hear that book?
I have had that recommended to me by three different people now.
Yeah, you should read it because
Mhm.
it's a really nice book about how you don't have to sort of throw out modern science and all that kind of progress. Like we don't have to become total like Luddites about it. But she is able to, Robin Wall Kimmerer is like, she's like a biologist, I think, as well as an Indigenous person who understands all the Indigenous beliefs about, working with nature. And that kind of thinking and that kind of synergy that we tried to show between the English girl and her dad and the WolfWalkers, which are like the oldest, most Irish Indigenous people, that sort of coming together at the end, I
Mhm.
think is the only way we can go forward, is if we can kind of look at Indigenous wisdom and Indigenous life ways and ways of seeing the world and seeing the environment as something that we're part of, it's not separate to us, and then bring all that we've learned from science and Western thought and all of that kind of stuff. And we can bring those two things together. Maybe there's some hope for grandchildren. I don't know.
Well, yeah, and it's scary, but I do think that this kind of storytelling is also motivating and inspirational. And one of the questions from the audience I had was about the Irish people's past, or sorry, the Irish people from the past viewing their connection to the environment and how that can translate now to modern era. So I feel like you've
Yeah.
kind of hit that, but at the time, was there? So we're looking 1650 is the era in which this story takes
Mm.
place. Was there a current awareness, do you think, at that time, or was it kind of separated by then?
It's hard to say. Like, I mean, we kind of go on a shopping trip through history and folklore and stuff when we're researching these things. And
Hmm.
definitely the stuff we drew out, which might be, you're always a victim of kind of looking at things through the lens of a modern audience. But there might have been a sense that the Celtic Church had become this kind of synergistic kind of mixture of pagan beliefs that were very connected to the land and were much more kind of matriarchal and much more connected to like naming, really having respect for land and understanding things in a way that was being lost, because when things got renamed with this kind of odd anglified version of things, we lost a certain connection to the countryside and to the landscape that we'd had prior to that. And we'd also had this kind of belief system about how we related to the forest and to the wolves and to all the fauna and everything. And that was all being lost as we kind of rushed to adopt this new English worldview and this another way of looking at the world as something that could be owned and controlled. And, so I don't know. I think there was wisdom. There's obviously wisdom in all Indigenous cultures because, we were like that for much longer than the way we've been lately. And when we look back into it, there was a lot of lovely stuff in Irish folklore and in Irish, even legends and myths and stuff that we could see, just like in Braiding Sweetgrass, where she looks back into her own Native American kind of culture to find solutions. I think there's stuff there. And I mean, I suppose that's the job of storytellers, to look at it and draw out what we need to move forward and leave behind the stuff that maybe was, not so healthy.
Well, and that you just segued into the next one, which was WolfWalkers does. Yeah, it's great when it saves me a little bit of effort, like 5 seconds of brain power to force a segue. When you do it for me, it's great.
I hope it's okay. I'm just kind of thinking off the top of my head, but it's okay.
No, it's great. So
Making
WolfWalkers
sense,
does a wonderful job giving younger viewers credit. How difficult is it creating a story for a younger audience that deals with important topics like feminism, standing up to authoritarian rulers, and caring for animals and the environment?
We take it pretty seriously. We show very rough cuts of the storyboards at different times to young kids. Like my wife teaches part-time in the Irish language school, and so she has kind of 8 to 10-year-old kids in her class, and so we very often show them the movie, and it's interesting just to sit with them and see where they're getting it and where they're not getting it, and then afterwards having a chat with them to see what they took from it and what they didn't. And we'd often tweak and rework the story to make sure that they were getting it and enjoying it and not bored, because the worst thing is for it to feel like edutainment or something, and that's kind of like eating your broccoli, watch this movie. So you kind of do have to keep it entertaining and interesting for kids, and kids are very honest. They won't kind of sugarcoat if they don't like it, or if they don't get something, they'll tell you. So they're really good. They're the notes I care about.
And in terms of just being a creator, are there specific things that you draw inspiration from, or are you the kind of creative mind that just you sit down with a notebook and kind of dump your brain and then go back through it? Like I'm an Ernest Hemingway fan in the write drunk, edit sober theory when I'm writing. And I'm not admitting to drinking during work if anyone's listening, but it is the process of just putting it all down on paper and then going back through and restructuring it. As opposed to trying to figure out everything I want to do and say in advance.
Yes.
Right. So it's get the words on the page and then put them in the right order.
Oh yeah. I think there's that. Like, I mean, Ross and I would have worked out a rough story and had themes and done a good bit of research. But when Will starts writing, he has to do what he calls a vomit draft, where he puts down everything into like a big, or we call it the fat baby sometimes, because it's full of everything we love, but it needs to slim down. It's got everything that in there, and there's always too many. There's always too many ideas. It's always a process of editing and refining, and all through the project, it's a big part of the creative challenges is refining and editing. But yeah, just getting it all down there first and kind of getting it out, and then seeing what you have is much better than for me anyway. That's a way to work. Another thing I kind of look for early on is kind of mythic moments that kind of say, like, if I can see an image in my head, or if I can sketch an image in those early story meetings that I feel says everything. Like I remember really hitting on a moment where Robin's dad is holding on to her so tight that she has to kind of leave her body behind. And so she has to become a wolf and leave her human body behind. And he's held on so tight to his daughter that he's left with this lifeless body in his arms. And I thought, oh, that's really mythic. That says everything about their relationship, at least at that point. And that's something that we could hold on to. So you'd have these kind of, like a clothesline with pegs on it. You'd have a few of these mythic moments that, like Robin getting bit by the wolf and seeing the world through different eyes. Like the minute she got bit, we knew we wanted the point of view of the character to literally change. So like that was another mythic moment that we had in mind. So you kind of have those, I suppose, to hang on to as you're writing and rewriting. Those moments have to happen in there. So you do have some kind of structure before you vomit it all down on the page.
Yes.
But other than that, it is. It's a process of putting it down and refining and putting it down and refining. and hoping that you're getting closer to what you originally intended and not wandering off into a totally different story, which can happen too.
Oh yeah, I have done that many, many times in news
Yeah.
writing even.
Wow.
Because sometimes that's the way the story goes, right? Like just as you get more
Mm-hmm.
information, all of a sudden you realize, oh, we're going in this direction now.
Yeah, I found that really interesting too, because myself and Ross realized and I think I felt this about nearly all the films. Maybe Song of the Sea the least, because that was very clear in my head what I wanted to talk about. We didn't wander too far. We just kind of did too much and we had to refine out. But there's a few stories in WolfWalkers we could have told, and we could have told it from a few different characters' points of view. And we could have satisfied screenwriting rules and had a different message. Like there's another story that you might have wandered into if you were just following the rules of what would be a nice, tidy story science kind of.
Yeah.
So yeah, that can be a really interesting part. Yeah, honestly, writing is the most difficult. I have to say, story is without a doubt the most difficult part of the process for me.
Yeah.
I never feel like I know what I'm doing, and when I start another film, I'm sure I'm going to feel like all sweaty and scared again. I just got away with it 3 times, and now I have to.
Well, and it's
own up to the fact.
I will never stop being amazed by the imposter syndrome felt by brilliant minds all over the world. It just it astounds me because, and again, I look at this and it's a masterpiece. It should have won the awards it was up for. And it's one I'm going to be recommending.
Good competition.
And talking with people about for screeners and things like that. It's so good. And an element of it, I think, is that, as I said earlier, each of the characters kind of has their own world that's existing, and it plays off the idea that everyone's at the center of their own story.
Yes.
Right. And that's something I think about when I'm in a shopping mall, and it kind of gives me a wave of panic because that's too many stories around me right now. Right. It's the influx of what's everyone else thinking right now. And then,
or if you're in like a huge city and you're like, whoa, suddenly people seem like ants. And then you have to remember that each one of them is the hero of their own little narrative and not just like it's strange. It's strange how we can be both at once. But just to your point about like the imposter syndrome, I've been talking about that a lot now because I'm in residency with other writers and artists, different disciplines. There's a guy you're writing an opera, for example, and we all have that sort of feeling. And I think there was a lovely, I think it was a TED talk I saw with, I think it was the woman who wrote like Eat, Pray, Love or something like that. But she talked about this idea that genius wasn't something you were, but something that was like a spirit that could pass through you. So you just have to show up to do the work. And that's your bit. And then hopefully, if you're lucky, you keep showing up to do the work and maybe genius might pass through you and go off to somebody else, So you never kind of get a big head thinking, oh, I'm a genius. But you do know that if you do the work, it might, the idea of a genius being more like a genie or a spirit or something rather than a person, I think is very interesting, and because that shows that the imposter syndrome isn't coming from nowhere. It's coming from the fact that all you really have is whatever talent you might have and whatever skills and discipline you've learned. And then it's just not in your hands. You just have to show up with that and earnestly try your best, and then hopefully you'll get it. But you just never know. That's what's terrifying and great about it,
I think that's true of creation, period. Whatever it is you make, right? Like I do craft stuff, and I started enjoying it the moment I went, I don't care if other people like it. It's fun for me to do. And now it's just fun. There's no more self-judgment on it. I can just do it and then put it in a box and be done with it, or take it out at a fair or something if I need to. But
I've been doing a lot of
sitting.
I get you. I've been doing a lot of life drawing, which is really interesting because I've been learning anatomy, and I thought I was pretty decent. But during lockdown, I really went for it. I bought a skeleton and I got a teacher and I started really working on it. And now here in Paris, I've just gone to like real life drawing class, like with actual models in the Beaux-Arts, and rather than, studying from photos and videos and things like that. And suddenly I was terrified. I was like, whoa, here I am. I actually have to do it. But the months of kind of study and craft and getting to understand how everything works allowed me to just work through the drawings. And then only that evening could I look at them and see what was good or bad. But while I was doing them, I was just relying on all that, like driving a car, you're kind of relying on those instincts that you know when to shift gears. If you think about it too much, you'll stall the car. But if you kind of feel how the car is going, you just follow that. And it's only afterwards you can kind of go, oh, I went from there to there, you know, based on those skills I'd sort of internalized.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. And again, I write a lot of articles and blogs and stuff, and I was in print news, and that's what I did every day. And I get asked about it, and it's hard to express sometimes because that's how it feels now. There's a mechanical comfort with the process.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So it's, oh, I know what I'm doing. I don't know if it'll be good, but I can just kind of do it now without having to list the steps. Or so the example of you know, get in the car and check all 3 mirrors and turn on the engine. Like no, you get in the car, you turn it on, you look around, you go.
I guess it's like musicians, they practice the scale so much, they're not thinking what note are they playing at what time. They're just kind of going with what feels right. Then they have to go back and write it down and go, what did I do?
Yes, that's the worst, having a conversation with someone and they go, did you write that down, what you just said? Oh, crap. One element of this, and again, I don't know if this was intentional or I think it's maybe part of your style, and it's a great place for us to sort of wrap a bit, was the combination of visual themes and storytelling methods. So in watching WolfWalkers, there are moments where it is comic book slides. There are moments where the perspective changes from 16:9 down to you know, something much more widescreen.
Portrait or
like there's various ways the format shifts a little bit, and we talked about those old the wood print backgrounds. I found that very appealing in that it kept my attention and it kept me sort of, oh, something's changing. But I'm also wondering thematically if that's how, as we talk about the environment, as we talk about wildlife, as we talk about traditional ecological knowledge and science and everything else, that is part of that general theme. I mean, it is literally in the story in that when people come together, they are able to succeed. But the story feels more complete to me because it incorporates different visual themes and visual tools. Is that, you know, also a microcosm of how do we deal with this great big world we're in right now?
That's interesting. Yeah, I think for me, like the thought out logic for it that Ross and I thought of was that when we were using split screens and stuff, we were trying to show how, you know, in the city people are sort of feeling like in boxes and they're thinking like that. And then when we opened out the vista, or maybe let the edge of the page sort of show where the paint is running off, that sort of felt like there was more possibility, you know, you weren't as framed in. And then we sort of were thinking about in comic books how you can play with the shape, or in medieval art even, you know, the triptychs and stuff, the shape of the frame itself can say something about what's going on in the picture. And I think that's something, I mean, obviously you can do that in live action, but you know, it's something that feels more organic and hand drawn. And I do think that there's for me anyway, there's stories that I can't imagine telling any other way than in hand drawn, because it is a language. And those kind of things that you're talking about, they're kind of intuitive. You try them out, you play with them, then you become conscious of them because you have to decide and say, yeah, we're doing that. Communicate that all down through the hierarchy of departments. And try not to lose the stuff that happens spontaneously in storyboarding as you go through, or maybe even improve on it. Rather than preserve it. Like sometimes the background artist might add a line that has a feeling of aggression to it around the corners of the screen. And then you're like, oh, that makes the whole image seem more aggressive or so on. So yeah, you're trying to kind of always play between the instinct and writing it down. You're kind of going between jazz and then writing it down, aren't you, all the time?
Yeah.
You know?
So I wonder then, is that, you know, is that mindset of let's play some jazz and write down the good bits? Is that, you know, the way we move forward?
In what way? In the broadest way about the world?
In saving the world and saving ourselves and trying to be nicer, kinder people, or whatever our goals are as we go through the world.
This rule-based, you know, strict morality way of thinking about things hasn't really gotten us into a good place. So maybe we should try a bit of jazz and a bit of experimentation and sort of conscious weeding and pruning of the way that we live. Yeah, I think it's happening. I think there's people that are at the cutting edge of thinking about this stuff, and then there's just society in general. And I kind of see consciousness raising in general. And I just hope it doesn't take too long, and that we can get there in time.
If you want to check out WolfWalkers in Canada, it's currently available to stream on Apple Plus. Find out more about WolfWalkers and other Cartoon Saloon films and projects at cartoonsaloon.ie. Tomm can be found on Twitter at Tomm Moore and Instagram at Tomm9769. Remember, that's Tomm with 2 M's. This was an awesome opportunity, and I can't thank Tomm and Cartoon Saloon enough for allowing me to have this great conversation. I also want to thank Christopher and Cynthia again for helping arrange the early steps. So check out Not About Lumberjacks, a short fiction podcast that may have voices you recognize, at nolumberjacks.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. Links, as always, are available in the show notes and at defenderradio.com. And of course, thank you for listening. This show is only possible because of you, so please do rate and review on Apple Podcasts or share a post about the show to help even more people listen. You can find me on Instagram and TikTok at Howie Michael and on Facebook on the Defender Radio podcast page. Defender Radio is produced by me, Michael Howie, and the Fur Bearers, a nonpartisan charitable wildlife protection organization. Learn more at thefurbearers.com. Until next time, I'm Michael Howie for Defender Radio and the Fur Bearers, reminding you to be kind and to stay informed and stay strong.